special effects creator Ray Harryhausen's influence on the world of filmmaking is staggering. In today's episode, we discuss his legacy.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Hey guys, welcome to the show. My name is Matt and I am your host. Thank you for joining me on the first episode of the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. I think this is going to be a fun adventure, guys. This is the show where we learn how to be better game masters and better role players by learning from people who tell stories and by filling ourselves with stories so that we can then communicate those at the gaming table. I really almost fanboyed out today because I got to talk to John Walsh, who knew Ray Harryhausen, the great special effects wizard, and talked to him about his new book. Ray Harryhausen's films were a great inspiration to me. One of the main reasons why I studied film when I went to college would be because I stayed up late watching Mighty Joe Young, Jason and the Argonauts, and The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. So this interview from me was a great treat, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So we will get on with the show. Well, my guest today is an award-winning filmmaker, a trustee of the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation, as well as the author of the new book, Harryhausen, The Lost Movies. John Walsh, welcome to the show.
Hi, Matt. It's good to be on your show. It's your inaugural show. Is that right? Is this your first podcast episode?
Yes, it is. Yes,
exciting.
It is.
So I'm the special first guest.
Yes, you are. Thank you so much for doing this. It's amazing.
You can cut your teeth on me.
Yes. Yes. No, I really appreciate it. So now we're going to mainly talk about Ray Harryhausen today. So for listeners who may not be familiar, who was Ray Harryhausen?
Okay, so many people might not know the name Ray Harryhausen, but they often know the films. So they might know Clash of the Titans, Jason and the Argonauts, The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad or The Golden Voyage of Sinbad, and 1 million years BC, that amazing poster that has Raquel Welch in a fur bikini on the beach. So people are like, oh, I remember that film, or, you know, that used to scare me as a kid, or my dad used to take me to the stuff with skeletons. So Ray Harryhausen created the special effects. So the stop motion animation effects. However, he's kind of unique in film history. I guess we'll discuss that as we go through the book. But up until Ray Harryhausen, and since Ray Harryhausen, nobody else has actually been the instigator of their own special effects. So if you were George Lucas or Steven Spielberg, you'd be going to people at Industrial Light and Magic to facilitate, if you will, the effects. And back in the day, you know, when King Kong was coming out, they went to Willis O'Brien to facilitate the Giant Ape. Ray Harryhausen was basically auteur, effectively. He was at the top of the decision-making pyramid, so he would decide which films to make, how to make. That's quite unusual if you're in a landscape where special effects technicians are brought in to facilitate somebody else's vision.
Yeah, and I think that is just amazing, and it certainly does set him apart. Could you define stop motion animation just a little bit?
Okay, yeah. So if we know what Walt Disney style animation is, a series of progressive drawings that move effectively one frame at a time. So in a second of film, there's 24 individual frames, and even today when we don't use film, we're using videotape. There are 24 sequential images that make up every second that we see on screen. So if you were to slow things down by 24, you would see each individual frame. So Ray has to animate his creatures one frame at a time using a tabletop sequence where the models, which would be kind of the size of maybe a G.I. Joe figure approximately, would be integrated with live actors. Now, how that trick is created is that you shoot the live actors first, you project them on a screen behind the small model, then you put a camera in front of the model and the projection, and everything moves by one frame at a time. So one click, the actors move along, you adjust your model to fit in with the action, and then one click, and it's quite laborious. It's tedious as well for people who don't have the patience. So it can take months or even years to finish a film in that process. But the effect is quite magical. The fact that we're talking about Ray Harryhausen today, and someone like George Lucas said when Ray Harryhausen died, there would likely have been no Star Wars without Ray Harryhausen. So even though his films are from the past, his influence very much affects the present day and the future.
Yes. I think I've heard there's a quote from Tom Hanks saying that he considers Jason and the Argonauts the greatest movie ever made over Casablanca or Citizen Kane.
That's right, yes. Tom Hanks gave Ray his honorary Oscar about 26 years ago. And at the ceremony, Ray Bradbury was there as well because they were good friends. And yes, Tom Hanks got into acting from watching numerous reruns of Jason and the Argonauts and thought it's so much fun. He wants to be an actor. Yeah. So even for people who didn't become technicians, there's an example with Tom Hanks. Ray's film have an indelible legacy and an influence. Mm-hmm. And the fact that the studios are still making money from them. 4 of Ray's films have been scanned in 4K. We're having a 4K premiere next week of one of his films, a world premiere of it. So people will be shelling out good money to see these films yet again in yet another format. And you can't say the same of other films from, say, 1958. We're showing a film of Ray's from 1958. Mm-hmm. Other bigger films with bigger stars from the day haven't even been scanned in 2K because people aren't interested. So, money talks in this instance, and Ray Harryhausen is still commercially viable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is amazing. Now, when you were talking about stop motion animation, just the level of technical skill required is extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes, because if you think you have to be an actor, but in increments. So if you were the actor, Matt, and you were the animator as well, and it's a sequence such as Medusa's Temple, so you're having to be feminine in your approach, but also monstrous because you're going to kill the people in the temple. Mm-hmm. You have to hold that in your mind, not for a few hours, but for weeks and months that sequence might take. And you're having to think which way the snakes were moving when you last touched them. Yeah. So you're having to have a pretty good memory. But also in Ray Harryhausen's kind of armory of technical skills and creative skills, he was a great drawer. He was a great sculptor. He had a great imagination. Now on a film, you'd have individual people carrying out each role. I mean, Ray did everything. He used to shoot the animation as well as build the little sets that went with them, try and match the lighting to location lighting from previous shoots and months ago. So he really was like a Swiss Army knife of skills. And it's sometimes hard when you explain it to an audience who are quite passive and think, yeah, it's just a movie. It is just a movie. But there was no one else who could do it like Ray. Whereas with Disney-style animation, there was other studios who were doing similar things. Now, if we think of the great work of Pixar, well, there's lots of other animation studios working in computer-generated imagery and doing marvelous stuff. If you were making a film, Matt, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and it was a creature feature, if you didn't go to Ray Harryhausen, you were going to be putting a man in a rubber suit.
Yeah.
So, that's he had almost a monopoly on the special effects terrain, as it were.
Because when I was a child, we had a TV channel here that would run kind of like a monster movie at night or whatever. And there were kind of like 3 types of films. There was what we would consider some classics like The Creature from the Black Lagoon. There were films that nobody really talks about anymore. And then there was this other class of film that really did seem magical. And come to find out years later, those would be Harryhausen films. And I was just kind of always struck by that his seemed very magical. Now, how were you introduced to his films in the first place?
For me, it was going to the cinema. So I saw some of his later films at the cinema and then catching up with VHS. So I'd tape the films when they aired on TV and just watch them over and over and over. And because I was a sort of a student of filmmaking, I had an 8mm camera. I used to do my own stop motion animations. Okay. Nothing anywhere close to what Ray Harryhausen did. But it got me interested in the process. And I would buy magazines and try and find out how it was done. And that was my in, as it were. And I continued making films and ended up then at the London Film School when I was 18. And I met Ray Harryhausen when I was there. I mean, he wasn't at the school, but I introduced him to the school. I wanted to make a documentary about his life and work, because despite the fact he was an American and his films are very American, or an American take, if you like, on historical drama, and the studios that backed him were Hollywood major studios, he shot the majority of his films in England from his base in London. So long before Steven Spielberg and George Lucas weaved their magic with Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars, Ray was there in the late 1950s working with British technicians in British studios like Shepperton, Pinewood. Interesting. And he's become, as you say, you could identify his films. He is a genre now in himself. If somebody said to you, Matt, that's like a Harryhausen move, or that's a Harryhausen type film. You know, Disney is a genre that people recognize in the golden era. Harryhausen, I think, is worthy of genre status.
Yeah. And because, I mean, I watched so many movies back then, but I have just say even one example, just a vivid memory of Mighty Joe Young and the lions jumping on Joe's back. And even being like, 7, 8 years old, I knew it was a special effect and it's a model, but Joe was alive. He was just alive.
Performance in Mighty Joe Young, of course, it's through the fingers of one animator. So if you strip away the technicality of it, Ray is acting through his fingers. And with CGI technology now, because things are farmed out to so many other sort of special effects houses, they create a house style for each of the creatures or each of the performers. And of course, it tends to be rather bland because there's no sharp edges to it. And that's why it has even though it can be photoreal, it can feel a kind of a step away from the drama. But interesting anecdote about Mighty Joe Young. When I recorded commentaries with Ray for his films, because he hadn't recorded for most of his film, we had different guests kind of sit in with us. Well, I said to Ray, why is there not a commentary track on Clash of the Titans? He said, they never asked me to. And I was like, oh, okay. Don't you think we should do it? No, I wouldn't remember anything, John. And I was like, oh, shall we give it a go? And he wasn't keen to go to a studio where it's quite sterile. And I said, look, we can do it in the house. I was working with a lot of award-winning cameramen and sound recorders who can, record really good quality sound anywhere, up mountains and so on. So I said, let's give it a go, and we'll see how it goes. So I think he was anxious that he wouldn't remember anything or it wouldn't be of any use. He remembered loads. So it became like regression therapy. And the more he watched, the more he remembered and talked about things he'd never spoken about before. So as we worked backwards from Clash of the Titans back through his other films, Ray would keep in touch with well-known filmmakers, and I'd make sure that I would ask any of them if they want to sit in with us. And for Mighty Joe Young, John Landis sat in with us and recorded with Ray because he's a very big fan of guerrilla films. One of his most influential experiences was watching Mighty Joe on regular repeats on American television, over and over and over. And so that got him into guerrilla pictures and cinema generally. So, Ray's sort of influence comes from all directions, but the fact that his films are family friendly and can be shown at any time, at night time, but also at lunchtime, key. Yeah. When we think of something like the sitcom Friends, one of the reasons that sells so well isn't because channels love it, and it is a fine sitcom, etc. It's because you can play it in the morning and at lunchtime and in the evening. It's a great schedule filler. Clash of the Titans is one of the most viewed films in cinema history, partly because it can play anywhere in any schedule, pretty much. So it surprises people that that's perhaps one of the most viewed films in cinema history. But the fact that you remember watching films quite regularly when they're on, I imagine there were all sorts of different times in the schedule.
Yeah. And I mean, you're mentioning Clash of the Titans. That was one that I saw on VHS, and it scared me. Like Medusa. Yeah. I mean, Medusa seemed like she was a real thing and a real creature there to, do some harm to you. And, but also the details, like when Medusa is is killed and she scratches the column. It just the attention to detail just is astounding.
It is. I mean, she's a spooky fact about Medusa that I can let you in on.
Okay.
We are restoring lots of the creatures because some are in disrepair. Medusa is one of the strange ones in that she hasn't really aged at all, and that in itself is a little bit spooky.
Yeah.
So she rarely ever needs any sort of restoration. When we came to making the Lost Movies book, we have sort of 3 categories of lost movies. The films that Ray planned to make and didn't. The films that Ray turned down, because it's always interesting to see what the outside world views of Ray, but also scenes cut from Ray's finished films. And all of Ray's films feature in there, including Clash of the Titans, including how Medusa should have been executed, but wasn't. So she was to meet her demise in a different way than how she did on screen. And we had storyboards and concept art, and it's all in the new book. So, because you remember that so vividly, you're probably thinking, wow, how different could it have been? Because you're even remembering the fingers doing the down the chalkboard thing where she dies at the end.
Yeah.
So, that there are so many facets to, deleted scenes is something that really came along with the advent of DVD technology, when you could add extra content. And more often than not, when you see a deleted scene, you'll think, yeah, I can see why that didn't make it to the picture. The last Star Wars film, The Last Jedi, had like 40 minutes of deleted scenes. And some of it, like a good 20 minutes, was on that casino planet. And I was like, really? Wow. When you think of the original Star Wars trilogy, Empire, Jedi, and Star Wars New Hope, there's barely a smidgen of deleted scenes. And it's like gold dust when you see the scene of, I think it's Luke on Tatooine with the droids before they go to Jabba's palace. I remember seeing that and I felt my heart stopping as I watched that scene. But now deleted scenes just seem like, why would you shoot 4 or 5 hours knowing you can only put 2 hours in theatres? But in Ray's day, having something change was a big to-do. And Medusa's execution changing was a big to-do. It really was. And it's all in the book.
Yeah. And I think we are almost a little spoiled in some way now that you can shoot a feature film with your iPhone. And just even for when I studied film in the kind of the mid 90s and early 2000s, even just working with Super 8 or 16 millimeter film, I mean, you just get a sense of how difficult it must have been to really pull some of these creatures off, and it just enhances the appreciation. Before we dive into your book, if somebody's new to Ray Harryhausen, what films do they need to see right now?
Very few people are that new to it because they'll have seen it sort of in the background. But I think the best one, which is my favorite, and you're not meant to have a favorite, but given that I'm a trustee of the foundation, I shouldn't have a favorite. And Ray asked me, do you have a favorite? And I told him, and he was, because so many people say Jason and the Argonauts, and I do love Jason, but it's not my favorite. It's not Jason. My favorite is the Golden Voyage of Sinbad from 1973.
Okay.
It's the middle of the 3 Sinbad films. It's the darkest in terms of its content. It frequently calls on the devil himself to help the villain out of his various problems. And the lead villain in the piece, Tom Baker, went on to play Doctor Who.
Yeah.
In television for many years here in the UK, and is very famous for it. I ended up getting Tom Baker to do a narration for my Ray Harryhausen documentary that I made in the late 80s, rather cheekily ringing him up and saying, I know you got your break as Doctor Who on Golden Voyage of Sinbad. Will you do a free narration for my Harryhausen documentary as a tribute to Ray Harryhausen? And he was cool about it. He said yes. The trailer for my book, which is on Amazon, has a brief excerpt of Tom Baker's voiceover and Ray sat in the cinema. But that's my favorite because I think it's the most accessible. It works as a story. It's quite pacey. It's got good-looking people in it. It's got a good Sinbad adventure. And it's genuinely quite scary. If you like what you see, then you can kind of work backwards to see most of Ray's other films, then work forward to see his last 2. But for me, it's Golden Voyage. I want Sony to do a 4K scan of Golden Voyage. So I'm gently pressing them on that.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive into your book. So the title, Harryhausen: The Lost Movies, kind of gives us an idea of the premise. And I will go ahead and I will put links to that in the show notes and everything, so people will be able to find that at my website, dicegeeks.com. So yeah, let's just, you told us a little bit about it, but let's just dive in. What can you tell us? What do you cover in the new book?
So the book covers the films Ray planned to make and didn't, the films he turned down, which was quite a revelation, and also scenes cut from his own films. And we were pleased to say there were significant scenes cut from every one of his films, some for budget reasons, some for technical reasons, and some for taste and decency reasons. Okay. So it's a bigger book than we thought it was going to be. So the publisher said, as an estimate, because they need to know for costings, for pages and so on, how many films you think roughly will feature and how many images. And I said, it could be as many as 45, maybe 50. And there could be maybe 100 and 120 images. It turns out there was nearly 80 and nearly 1,000 images.
Wow.
And we were like,
I mean, that's just incredible to think that there were so many films that, for those various reasons, that weren't done. Can you give us some standouts?
Yes, absolutely. So if I said to you there were some unmade Sinbad films and some unmade dinosaur films, you might think, oh, okay, yeah, I can imagine that there would be unmade films like that. But in the 1960s, Ray tried to secure the rights to the Conan series.
Oh, okay.
So he tried to get the Conan novels brought to the screen, and the difficulty was you couldn't make them family friendly, because Conan novels, if anyone's read them, they're quite they're ultra violent, effectively. Yeah. So if you were a studio head at the time and someone was pitching ultra violence plus sword and sandal, which is kind of the shortcut phrase that they would give films where your leading man might be wearing a sandal and walking in the desert. So be it Ben-Hur or any biblical film or anything to do with that era. Sword and sandal is what they call them. Yeah. If it was ultra violent and sword and sandal, they felt that there wouldn't be an audience, because studios felt that was a juvenile audience anyway. So if you made something that was a sort of a 18s and over certification, then no one's going to be able to go and see it. So they would imagine it'd be like making a Walt Disney film with graphic sex and swear words. It seems a contradiction. So Ray parked that idea. Of course, when Conan did come out in the 80s with John Milius's version with Arnold Schwarzenegger, it was a great success and actually forged that genre of ultra violence and sword and sandal in stone. It was commercially successful, and that road leads right up to Game of Thrones today on HBO. Without the success of Conan in the cinema and making significant money, probably Game of Thrones wouldn't be in its current form as we see it. So that was a big surprise in terms of films Ray pursued. He was also pursuing quite regularly the estates of H.G. Wells.
Okay.
Now, Ray planned to make War of the Worlds before George Powell.
Oh.
And Ray Harryhausen's version of War of the Worlds, which I don't know if you can see the little bookmark there.
Oh, yeah. That's
I'm holding up. He would have had tripod Martians bestriding the landscape.
Okay.
And so his would have been very different to the George Powell version, which had kind of saucers kind of hovering.
Yeah.
So he didn't get War of the Worlds made. He did discuss it with George Powell that he was planning to try and get the rights for War of the Worlds, and then Powell beat him to it. He also happened, I think perhaps in terms of a mistake, although he was very friendly with Powell, he mentioned to Powell another film that he tried to make that Powell then also made, The Time Machine.
Oh, wow.
So they were two of four H.G. Wells novels that Ray tried to option. The other two included a film called Food of the Gods, which at the time seemed quite a fantastical tale, but actually is quite pertinent now. And it was about farm animals being grown to an enormous Godzilla size, and then things getting out of control, as they would if you had a chicken that was the size of a tower block.
Okay.
And we have brilliant concept art for that and for War of the Worlds inside the Lost Movies book.
Okay.
There's even test footage for War of the Worlds that Ray shot to try and tease the studio. And some of that's in the trailer for the book. But the fourth and final time he pursued the H.G. Wells estates, he was lucky, and he secured the rights to First Men in the Moon.
Yes.
And that hit screens in 1964, and that's been scanned in 4K. So that film has had a splendid rejuvenation. In some territories, it played in 70mm. I hosted the 4K premiere here in London last year to a packed cinema. So, a film that's been seen numerous times. It's not a favorite Harryhausen. It's not one that was his most successful by any means. But the fact it was a 4K scan had people really excited. And it had 5.1 stereo, which is quite an achievement if you know how difficult it is to separate tracks when everything's on optical stems. Sony done a beautiful, beautiful job. So we're kind of always surprised by what we find. In terms of the films he turned down, I think the one that surprised all the people at Comic-Con, I did San Diego Comic-Con in July, and we showed footage and we showed images and all sorts. And then we got to what did he turn down? He turned down the first Marvel's film in 1984.
That is unbelievable.
So, and it was an approach directly from Stan Lee, who'd written the screenplay for X-Men. And we have the letters, we have the scripts, and we have Ray's response. And it wasn't simply the case that Ray said, I don't do comic strips, or I don't like this. More often than not, he was flattered by the offers. It was later in his career. It was after Clash of the Titans, and he wasn't looking to work for other people at this stage. They'd worked a couple of times for other people in the sort of the 40s and then once in the 1960s. But generally speaking, he tried to get his own projects up and running. So it's always fascinating to see what he turned down, because it gives you a view of how the outside world views you. Because, if you were to get a load of job offers, whether it's through LinkedIn or anywhere, it says a lot what people think about you. And if they're bad offers or it's bad money, you think, I must be projecting the wrong image, or my CV must be terrible. But it is fascinating. Ray was tantalizingly involved and asked to be involved in so many wonderful films. Twice he had to turn down Dino De Laurentiis. Once in Christmas 1975, when Dino rang him directly at his London home. So not going through agents or attorneys or managers or PR companies as you might today. Dino De Laurentiis rang him up, said, I've secured the remake rights on one of the biggest films in Hollywood history, and I want you to, set your shop up, as they used to call it, to do the effects for the remake of King Kong. And they had a massive budget. They had all of the rights secured. They had a wonderful cast coming together. And Ray said, "This is marvelous. When I would consider working on your picture, because King Kong was a big influence on Ray. And what's your schedule?" He said, "We need to be in theaters in 12 months." No, because 12 months wouldn't be enough time to prep. Certainly not enough time to get all of the effects work done, because Kong is in so many of the key scenes. So in the end, what do they have to do? And this is 1976. They put a man in a monkey suit. And I mean, that not to diminish the achievement of King Kong 76. I am a fan of that film, and I think the work Rick Baker and Carla Rambaldi did was exceptional, and they rightly deserve the Oscar they received. But it seems like a step backwards in some ways to do that. So the book is full of those revelations.
That is amazing. I'm just kind of also struck at the amount of kind of concept art models and material that was created for these projects that never came to be. So I know the book showcases a lot of those things. So these were original things that created by Ray Harryhausen himself.
Yes, because for pitch meetings, Ray's films are very visual. So if they're meeting a studio head and they want to get a green light on something, it's very important to have something visual you can show. So production art was mainly created to try and secure finance. And then it was used after that then to set the kind of the house style, and you'd speak to art directors and production designers to help build from that. But yeah, when I've spoken to other filmmakers, they'll have scripts or they'll have letters and so on, but you couldn't really make much of a book out of that.
Mm-hmm.
It's lucky for us that Ray worked in such a visual medium.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I spoke to other filmmakers, it's a funny thing. As a filmmaker myself, I don't like talking about my unmade films. And when I speak to other filmmakers, they're like, oh, I don't like talking about it, but I can tell you this if it's off the record. And I'd say, well, do you ever want to go on the record? And they'd say, well, why? Would you? And I'd be like, no, I wouldn't. So there is a professional embarrassment is probably the best way to describe it. That's, in one way, it's great to see this material out, but in another way, I feel that Ray might feel slightly compromised that there were so many opportunities lost or so many failures to launch. When we put the book together, because there have been other Harryhausen books, one of my dilemmas was, for this to be definitive, how do we create a forward? I do an introduction which explains who Ray is, my relationship to Ray, and so on, and why I wrote the book. But we wanted a standout forward. And originally we were thinking of having just a forward from a well-known filmmaker. Mm-hmm. And then I got thinking, well, what would a well-known filmmaker say? They would say something like we've just said, Matt. I used to watch on video, or I used to go to theaters and see, and then I decided I would follow in similar footsteps, and I kind of did, and I made these films, and if it wasn't for Ray Harryhausen, and that is not to diminish Ray's legacy, but I wanted it to be something more than that. It needed to be more than just a personal reflection of somebody's journey for the forward, given that it represents so much a body of work. I mean, it's a book that's been almost 100 years in the making. It's Ray's centenary next year. And as a very young man, he was sketching and doing puppet theatres and marionettes. And the book's been sort of 3 years in the making. So, it's been a bit of an interesting project. So in the end, we left the forward till the end because I'd had this idea and I wanted to float it with the publisher and I didn't want to scare them off. And it's a bit of an unusual way of doing a forward. We have 5 well-known filmmakers contributing to what I've called the Filmmakers Forward, where they've come forward. Some are people who you might expect from the fanboy area of Ray Harryhausen, and some are not, but they're all well-known. And I said to them, look, can you reflect on your own unmade films, as painful as that is, please, and on Ray's as part of this forward? And they were very generous, and they've all revealed things they've never spoken about before. And we have people in there such as Nicholas Meyer from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Mike Hodges, Flash Gordon in The Omen 2, the brilliant John Borman, Deliverance, and Excalibur, Hope and Glory, and so on. John Landis, who I assume needs no introduction, but American Werewolf in London, Michael Jackson's Thriller, Trading Places, and Guillermo del Toro, winner of Best Picture for Shape of the Water, Hellboy, and so on. He's a wonderful person. So our forward has an embarrassment of riches for people who get the book. They'll get to see what these filmmakers have to say about their own unmade films, and in some cases naming studios and titles, and what it does to the creative process, because it's not necessarily a good thing to learn by your mistakes that you move on from, which is what we're often told in these situations. It can actually be quite painful and quite a drain on your creative resource. That's why it's all the more surprising that Ray kept going. There was less films he tried to make as he entered the 60s and 70s, but those ones he did try to make, the production art is absolutely outstandingly fabulous. So he became concentrated his energies and focused his attention on these films, and the art is absolutely gorgeously fabulous. I don't know if there's enough words in the English dictionary to describe it, but I feel really proud to be able to put this book together because for me it's been less of a writing challenge, more of a detective challenge. There are 50,000 items in the Ray Harryhausen Foundation archive, and of all of the finished films like Clash of the Titans and Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger, those materials are kind of collected together. We could find those. So if you ask me, Matt, for something from one of Ray's finished films, we could find it for you relatively quickly. It would take maybe just a few hours or maybe a day. Whereas if you're looking for something you don't even know if it exists, or you find a bit of artwork and there's no paperwork to go with it, then all of a sudden you're having to become a real detective. Is this even one of Ray's lost films, or is it some art someone sent to him? What's this? He's scribbled on a note here. Maybe it's faded and you can only read some of it. So it really was tricky to see what qualified and which films were eligible. Mm-hmm. And the last film I found was from 1956. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the one that surprised me the most and got journalists in the UK. There's been a couple of I think I sent through to you some of the big news articles we had. Yes. There's been some big news stories around the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because what news people want to know is, but what was exciting? What was different? What was unusual? So you want to know the news angle. So
Yeah. Now, I think it's interesting, we are talking about what an influence, Ray Harryhausen was on all of these, fantastic filmmakers of today. But it did seem like it was very hard for him to get movies made, doesn't it?
Yes. I mean, there was, when I started in television, there was only 4 channels here in the UK. When Ray was working with the studios, there were only some studios who'd be prepared to wait as long as it took for these films to be delivered. Mm-hmm. So studio heads in Hollywood now can last for as few as maybe 6 or 12 months. If you were doing a Harryhausen film and you were commissioning it in 1970, it might be 1973 or 4 before it's in theaters. So you'd have to be pretty confident as a studio head who's greenlit a project that, it's going to be worth the wait and that you're still going to be in position. So I think one of the biggest problems has been people not being in post long enough to see the fruits of their commissioning labours, and also its box office as well. There were less screens, but films played for longer. Mm-hmm. So you'd get a situation in the 70s where a film like Grease could play in a cinema throughout the entire summer. Mm-hmm. And which is, on one hand, it's a good thing because if people like seeing Grease and they go back and watch it, but it means it strangulates new films coming out, trying to get screen time. Mm-hmm. So distributors and exhibitors, the exhibitors being cinemas, really had things kind of tied up in a way that now it's not the case, with so many other ways to view, whether it's home rental or downloads and so on. I'm not sure Ray would have an easier time of it now, but he certainly had a very difficult time. And frustratingly, he was on the money. He was on the money with Conan. He was on the money with other genres being revived. If only people had listened. But had they done, maybe some of the films we know and love wouldn't have happened. Ultimately, if some of these earlier films had happened, maybe Clash of the Titans wouldn't. So we wouldn't have had Medusa and so on. So, the cards fell where they did. If we learn anything from this book, it's that as much as it is difficult to get over the rejection, and even now when I get rejected, I find it's never nice. It's never a nice feeling. You have to kind of think, right, well, put that to one side. Let's go again. It's not even a roll of a dice. It's about persistence and hard work. In Ray's case, he had exceptional talent. But in most cases with people who are successful, it's more persistence than anything else. Mm-hmm. And you can see that in life today, whether it's public life or politics or entertainment. It's not necessarily the best people who are in those posts. It's the people who are most persistent. Mm-hmm. So, a lesson to be learned is be more persistent.
No, absolutely. Okay, well, you mentioned it just a little bit. Could you tell us about the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation?
Well, Ray set up the Ray and Diana Harryhausen Foundation in the 1980s, 1986. And Diana, of course, was his wonderful wife, Diana Harryhausen. Mm-hmm. She was the great-granddaughter of David Livingstone, the famous explorer.
Oh, wow.
So between them, they lived in a beautiful house in West London, in the Holland Park. And she really was a wonderful support to Ray. And in the house, he kept the vast majority of the creature collection. So if you ever went to visit him at Ilchester Place and were ever invited into his house, then you would get to meet the original stars from all of those films. Mm-hmm. So Ray set up the foundation as a charitable trust foundation in the 80s to protect and preserve the creature collection, but also to protect, preserve and promote his form of animation. Because for some of the technical processes, he actually kind of coined them himself. So he actually created different technical processes to help combine live action with animation. And in his lifetime, he saw a sort of a demise in stop motion and a demise in combining live action with animation. But then there was a revival, so shortly before Ray died, well, I suppose a few years before Ray died, there was things like Nightmare Before Christmas, Tim Burton stop motion film, James and the Giant Peach and so on, and the Aardman animations like The Wrong Trousers and so on. Mm-hmm. Now, in more recent years, you have Kubo and the Two Strings. Oh, yeah. You have Isle of Dogs. So stop motion is not only current, but it's also successful. And, mainstream cinema is welcoming stop motion back in a way that it never did in the past. Mm-hmm. You would never see a full-length feature animated film entirely in stop motion. So a lot of young animators are returning to these older techniques because they find that they can achieve a more instantaneous performance and are using digital tools and computer graphics to help aid and assist a stop motion environment. So the tail has come off the digital dog and has swapped back onto the stop motion dog, but there is digital tools that are being used. So, I don't think it's a case of using one or the other. It's a case of utilizing both to make the best story you can.
Sure. Did he have any proteges that carried on his work?
Yes. So when people would correspond with Ray, for example, in the 50s, he was sent a wonderful mask, the Cyclops from the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, one you could place over your entire head. And it's beautiful. It really looks like the Cyclops from the film. And the young sculptor who created that, Ray wrote back to him and encouraged him and so on, and they had correspondence back and forth. And that was Rick Baker, who 7 Academy Awards later is one of the most honored men in special effects cinema. Now, his effects are much more to do with practical effects and animatronics. But it's somebody who was, if you like, a direct inheritor of the Harryhausen crown was Phil Tippett at Industrial Light and Magic. Mm-hmm. And of course, his wonderful special effects. You can see the stop motion Tauntauns in The Empire Strikes Back, those kangaroo style creatures, and the AT-AT walkers. Interestingly, when George Lucas came to fiddle around digitally with all of his films, all of the stop motion that Phil Tippett did needed no assistance. It needed no Jar Jar Binksing or whatever you want to call it. It remains intact, thank goodness.
Well, yeah, thank goodness.
Yeah. So there is this obsession with Hollywood that if it's old, it needs fixing.
Yeah.
It is an older technique, but it didn't need fixing. And of course, Phil went on to work on RoboCop, Dragon Slayer, which is one of my favorite films.
Oh yes.
And supervised what was going to be the stop motion animation on Jurassic Park. And of course, they shot lots of tests of it in stop motion. They look wonderful. Mm-hmm. And of course, Dennis Muren, who's another big Harryhausen fan and a big friend of the foundation, he developed a new computer system to develop computer animation for Jurassic Park. But Phil stayed on board with Jurassic Park to help with the dinosaur movements. So that's a great example of new technology and older techniques fusing together to create a wonderful cinema experience. So lots of people have kind of been influenced by and have directly continued stop motion. Phil's probably the best and most high profile example.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned the collection. Can people see the collection of Ray Harryhausen's works?
They can't come to the archive itself because if they look directly at Medusa, she'll turn you to stone.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But when she's on her best behavior, when she's at exhibits, you can see the collection in different places. Last year, we were at the Oklahoma Science Museum, where we had quite a few pieces. Next year, for Ray's centenary in 2020, we're having a major exhibition at the Scottish National Gallery. And that's going to feature all of the creatures fully restored, and many of the creatures from the Lost Movies book as well, including footage and drawings never seen before. So we regularly show pieces, sometimes large or small. We're in talks with the Oscars Museum, so we're going to be doing something with them, and the Lucas Museum of Narrative Arts as well. So we're going to be doing something with George Lucas, which is going to be exciting.
Well, that's fantastic. Just thinking about just wrapping up our conversation here, it is truly Ray Harryhausen just seemed to be like a one-of-a-kind visionary.
Yes, but at the time his films were being made, if you think about what was happening over at the Walt Disney Studios, there was no mistaking a new film from Mr. Disney. It would say clearly on the poster, Walt Disney Presents, or from Walt Disney, and so on. Rightly so. Rightly, I have no complaints about that. If you were to look at the films that Ray was making, his name would be on the poster somewhere if there was a credits block. Credits block is the block of titles that would also include written by and music by and so on. But it never said anywhere on the posters, even on Clash of the Titans, Ray Harryhausen Presents. Yeah. So his work was fully appreciated, I think, in his retirement years. And it's people like us, Matt, that have kept things going. And, you know, we might have been called geeks or fanboys at one stage, but actually what we are the people we are the audience. You know, Comic-Con was full of, if you like, fanboys and fangirls, but people of every possible age. So the audience really appreciates Ray's work. If someone's willing to pay to see it again, then you know that you're onto something. They're not looking at it for the sake of it being old. There's lots of old films that are rubbish. And, you know, because films are old doesn't make them good. And I see a lot of old rubbish. I watch too much TV, I think maybe that's why. But lots of really old films that should never have been scanned in any definition that seem to have made it back, because there are so many opportunities now to put content out there. The great thing about that is, in a sea of mediocrity, Ray Harryhausen's beacon flashes, you know, like a light in the storm. People are drawn to it. They'll see, oh, it's in the schedule. Oh, I love that movie. I'm gonna tune in. And in the UK, I don't know about where you are, Matt, but Ray's films will always play at a special time. So it might be a Christmas time or New Year's or a public holiday and Easter. The same as the James Bond films. When they would debut on television, it would normally be during some special holiday period. So growing up with the films showing in those sort of special periods also, I think, brings its own sort of sense of magic as well. So I don't think the films ever lose that. And if we can fill a cinema with a 1958 4K scan of Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, then I think the next 50 or 100 years are pretty secure.
Yeah. I think it's just, like we've been saying, it's just kind of astounded by the quality of his work. And I just thank you for joining me today. Your book is going to have a prominent place in my library. I can tell you that. So again, just John, thank you for joining us.
You're most welcome. If you ever see me, bring a Sharpie with you. I'll sign it for you.
Oh, that would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. Actually, I never met Ray Harryhausen, but I did get his autograph through an acquaintance. So it is a prized possession of mine. So I'll drop a picture of that in the show notes as well for everybody. All right. Thanks, John.
No, well, I'm happy to. You know, Ray was very generous with me. I was an 18-year-old film student and I had no credits. He had no reason to let me into his house to see his entire collection. I mean, can you imagine that now, knocking on the door of a famous person's house and saying, can you let me in? I'm a film student. I want to have a look. They'd release the Hounds or something. Yeah. You know, he was so generous with his time. So it's only right that we sort of replicate that and are generous with our time. And when I'm talking about Ray.
Okay. Well, thank you. Actually, one question I forgot to ask.
Sure.
What was he like as a man?
Well, Ray was a very generous man. So when we think about the film industry, the perception is that it's an industry full of takers. And Ray was very much a giver, you know, giving of his own time, of his own patience, and of his own advice as well. So if he saw another animator contacting him, he wouldn't think, oh, this is a rival. I better shoot him down because, you know, I don't want him taking the ground that I fought so hard to secure. No, he was incredibly generous. And as like a lot of very creative artists, he would want to share his thoughts and views to help, as it were, expand his own art. So that really is exceptional. When you speak to people who've since become well-known filmmakers who contacted Ray in the past, they'll tell you the same thing, that he was a generous person, generous with his time and very patient. And I guess if you are animating the skeleton sequence from Jason the Argonauts for the best part of 8 months, then patience had better be one of your key skills and personality traits.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, John. It's been great. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Well, guys, I hope you really enjoyed this interview with John Walsh. I just found it fascinating to learn about the films that could have been from Ray Harryhausen. In the show notes at dicegeeks.com, I will link up John's book. I will put some links to some interviews with Ray Harryhausen. I will also put a link to Ray Harryhausen's filmography so you can start working your way through some of these masterpieces that he created. If you want to support the show, guys, it would mean a ton to me. You can go to Patreon/DiceGeeks and support the show there. You can also like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Those things just help me get the show out there so more people can hear it, so more people can learn about some of these fascinating things that we're going to be talking about. And if I haven't said it already, I thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me each week as I release these episodes. And until then, keep gaming.